The only console with a built-in ability to crush everything it sees has arrived. Segaiden invisibly touches the Sega Genesis. 'Cause it's another day for you and me in paradise. This week, Sega kicks off the next-gen console wars. And I'll say this for their new console, once it crawls under your skin, you're never quite the same. The mighty Sega System 16 arcade board and its variants ruled the arcades in the late 80s. From what I can tell, once it took root, it became the single most prolific platform for coin-op releases in the 80s. Sure, Namco's Galaxian and Pac-Man hardware sold better individually and were widely cloned by bootleggers, but in terms of the sheer number of unique game titles released for a coin-op architecture, nothing topped the System 16 until the Neo Geo MVS came along. At home, though, Sega didn't really take its console manufacturing efforts seriously, at least not in the beginning. The company put a machine out into the world in 1983, the SG-1000, but their efforts were hyper-localized in Japan, with some external distributors doing the lifting for them in parts of Europe and Australia. Nevertheless, that machine turned out to be a success that greatly outperformed the company's own internal metrics and expectations. It may not have come close to hitting the numbers that Nintendo's Famicom juggernaut produced, but the SG-1000 was the only console, besides Nintendo's, to survive the 1983 console gold rush in Japan. And so the SG-1000 evolved into the Mark III, which soon arrived in Europe and the Americas under the name Master System. Well, the Sega System. But the Master System moniker stuck, and that's how we know it today. Sega, of course, operated primarily in arcades in those days, a venue where they saw headline-grabbing success with their inventive tech and creative interfaces. More importantly, the bespoke nature of arcade boards allowed Sega to iterate constantly on their own work, steadily improving their baseline Z80 architecture by adding coprocessors, superior graphics chips, and additional RAM. The company did apply a similar philosophy to its consoles. Although the base SG-1000 hardware represented a sort of fixed point in space, with its 3 MHz Z80 chip and 1 megabit of RAM serving as the universal standard for the original console that developers had to target, Sega still employed an arcade-like mindset for its annual iterative upgrades. 1984 saw the advent of the SG-1002, a visual overhaul for the console that updated its shell to a more modern look and replaced the hardware joysticks with removable joypads. 1985 saw the arrival of the Card Catcher, a cartridge port peripheral that opened the door to the second generation of SG-1000 software on the slim, inexpensive MyCard format. And soon after that, Sega updated the SG-1000 with its third iteration, the Mark III, which truly applied the company's arcade mindset to the concept of home console hardware. Although the Mark III ran on the same CPU as the SG-1000, to the point that it could still be expanded into an SC-3000 home computer and run SG-1000 games, the Mark III boasted 8 times the work RAM and sported a powerful new video chip that did most of the work for the console, totally leapfrogging the Famicom in terms of basic capabilities. The Mark III shipped as the Sega System and Master System in America in 1986, establishing a foothold on the overseas market, while lagging well behind Nintendo and even Atari Corp in terms of install base. Still, a foothold is a foothold, and it gave Sega the experience and knowledge of the US market that would allow its next hardware iteration to fare far better in the West than its 8-bit machine did. Sega did iterate one last time on its 8-bit hardware, with a 1987 Japanese release that brought the Western console design and Master System name back home, while integrating advanced features like FM synthesis, 3D glasses support, and light phaser compatibility, all into a single ultimate Sega 8-bit machine. But around the same time that this Master System model showed up in stores, NEC shipped the PC Engine system, and definitively became the most powerful console on the Japanese market. And so Sega did here exactly what it had always done in arcades: respond by upping the stakes. And here too, the company took notes from its coin-op efforts. The SG-1000 internally resembled the VicDual arcade platform, the Master System shared a lot in common with the System 1 platform, but in arcades, Sega had phased out that 8-bit tech and replaced it with a next-generation architecture based on Motorola's 68000, a powerful and efficient 16-bit chip that had already seen adoption in cutting-edge graphics-focused home computers like the Apple Macintosh, Commodore Amiga, Atari ST, and NEC 68000. The 68000 and its successors powered the company's stunning superscalar hardware line for almost a decade, eventually culminating in the glorious chaos of Jurassic Park. And of course, it powered the all-important, world-spanning System 16 system. And so when it came time to take the tech lead in the home console space once again, Sega did what it had always done and looked to its arcade work for inspiration. So at the end of 1988, the company unleashed the mighty Mega Drive upon Japan, a console built in the image of its System 16 arcade boards. Make no mistake, the Mega Drive, which we know in America as the Genesis, was not technically just a consoleized version of the System 16 board. The Genesis offered less power in all respects than the coin-op spec, because ultimately a home consumer device has to be affordable, or else no one's going to buy it, and then what's the point? The only company crazy enough to attempt coin-op console parity would be SNK with the MVS and its consoleized version, the AES, and hardly anyone could afford that. Which was fine by SNK. Their business was selling MVS hardware and interchangeable game cartridges built around that standard to amusement vendors. And the console side of things was just a fun bonus for the Patrick Batemans of the world to kill time with between rounds of snorting blow off a hooker's butt. But the Genesis tech came close enough to be a convincing fake. The System 16 was built around a 10 MHz 68000 with a 4 MHz Z80 subprocessor controlling a Yamaha YM2151 FM synth sound chip. Genesis clocked in with a 7.6 MHz 68000 paired with a 3.58 MHz Z80 to control its Yamaha YM2612 FM synth sound chip. If System 16 was God, Sega clearly created Genesis in their own image, although I'm pretty sure that's not where the name came from. The Genesis possessed less power than the System 16. It couldn't push as many sprites at a time, it had a much smaller color palette, and its Yamaha audio chip could perform fewer modulation functions than the arcade sound processor. Nevertheless, it gave Sega's development teams a highly familiar architecture to work with, and even third parties who hadn't produced games for System 16 would find the industry-standard components easy to navigate compared to, say, the fussier custom architecture that Nintendo crafted for its own 16-bit system. The downgraded chips had another benefit besides cost savings. The Z80 audio controller was the exact same chip that had powered the SG-1000 and Master System, meaning that the Genesis could offer true backward compatibility by putting the main processor to sleep and running Master System software from the Z80. But by no means was Genesis a backward-facing console. Despite its hooks for legacy software, the Genesis saw Sega looking forward. The system offered true RGB output through its custom video connector. And while that connector only provided mono audio, the console generated stereo sound that players could tap into through a standard 3.5mm stereo jack on the front of the console, complete with its own volume slider. This unusual design offered flexibility. Genesis owners could run a line from that jack into a home audio setup, or they could plug in headphones to avoid annoying parents or roommates. And to top it off, Sega finally designed a decent controller for the Genesis. They replaced the wretched square D-pad of the Master System with a circle and cross design that dodged Nintendo's crosspad patent, but still felt responsive and precise. And then, they went and gave players 3 action buttons and an integrated start button. Sure, technically that meant the Genesis controller just had as many buttons as the NES, but trading out the largely useless select chiclet in favor of a full-sized C button made a huge difference for action games, which would prove to be the Genesis's stock and trade. The Genesis had its quirks, of course, such as a powerful sound chip that could produce stunning audioscapes in the right hands, and clamorous din that resembled a vomiting robot in the wrong hands. But still, it was a hell of a machine all around. Powerful, flexible, extensible, and above all, easy to work with. Even so, the Mega Drive would fare poorly in Japan. Not only did it fail to match the sales of Nintendo's indomitable Famicom and Super Famicom, it couldn't even best PC Engine. In the US and Europe, however, sales figures would tell a different story. When Mega Drive hit Japan, PC Engine had already enjoyed a year of making inroads against the flagging Famicom. After the Mega Drive launched, NEC countered with the PC Engine CD-ROM, a revolutionary add-on that Sega would scramble to compete with as well. This put Mega Drive on the back foot from day one, and meant that Sega ultimately only sold about half as many Mega Drives as NEC did PC Engines, in Japan. In America, on the other hand, the Genesis arrived right about the time that the NES reached the point of market saturation. I'd personally say that the NES would hit the peak of its popularity a few months later in 1990 when Super Mario Bros. 3 arrived. But it meant that Sega had a strong foundation to operate from when the older console began to fade here as well, a perceptual decline surely hastened by a cutting ad campaign that directly compared the two consoles' capabilities. As for the PC engine, well, that proved to be effectively a non-issue for Sega in America. NEC didn't ship the localized TurboGrafx 16 until shortly after Genesis's launch, and despite all that the PC engine had going for it in Japan, its initial American lineup turned out to feel pretty paltry in the face of Genesis's launch library. Genesis feels like a fresh start for Sega, and maybe that's where the console got its name. Or maybe Sega just wanted this to be a system that people played tonight. In terms of capabilities, the Genesis utterly crushed the aging NES. Even the forthcoming wave of MMC5-powered cartridges couldn't begin to compare what Genesis could accomplish without breaking a sweat. Even the TurboGrafx 16 couldn't compare, despite masquerading as a 16-bit system. NEC's console ran on an amped-up version of the chip that powered the NES, a decidedly 8-bit chip, 16-bit graphical processor bandwidth notwithstanding. Genesis even challenged the Super NES, as customized a piece of gaming tech as had existed in the home console space since Intellivision, and one that shipped 2 years later, with all of Nintendo's war chest behind it. The Genesis's architecture made it considerably less tricky to develop for, and while it couldn't boast the number of colors or the hardware-level graphical effects that Super NES had up its sleeve, developers eventually figured out a way to fake those elements. The Genesis was also quite extensible in a way that mirrored Nintendo's consoles. Although it proved so prohibitively expensive that Sega only used it for a single cartridge, the Genesis could even support polygonal 3D through add-on cartridge tech. And the system's side-mounted expansion bus was put to good use in short order for the Sega CD add-on, a slick piece of tech that matched and exceeded the capabilities of NEC's CD-ROM by granting the console extra features like streaming digital audio, real-time video playback, and of course, several hundred times the data storage capacity available to solid-state cartridges at a fraction of the manufacturing cost. Really, the Genesis story echoes Nintendo's consoles in a lot of ways. For one thing, Sega launched it as yet another platform for which Sega itself acted as the sole software publisher, just like Nintendo had with Famicom. And not unlike with Famicom, the Genesis publishing model only began to shift toward a third-party licensing approach after about a year on the market, with certain third parties forcing the issue. Accolade and Electronic Arts both made efforts to bypass Sega's lockout technology, with the latter in particular wielding a nuclear-level threat that encouraged Sega's cooperation. And despite the coercion, this turned out to be a boon, just as Namco had somewhat forcibly inserted itself into the Famicom market only to help drive console adoption. EA's games, especially their annual sports releases, became a cornerstone of the Genesis business that helped Sega sell tens of millions of consoles, a success the company could only have dreamed of back in the early SG-1000 days. The upshot is that by the time the Super NES arrived in the US, the Genesis had enjoyed 2 full years of growth in which to establish itself. Sure, the NES and TurboGrafx 16 were out there, and so was the Neo Geo AES for all the coked-out day traders, but marketing had drawn a clear line of demarcation that clearly placed the Genesis and Super NES in direct opposition to one another. And Sega took advantage of that setup to make life tough for Nintendo's new console. With canny advertising and a strong and ever-expanding software lineup, the Genesis remained well ahead of the competition until late in the generation. Even when Nintendo landed big exclusives for Super NES, like Star Fox and the all-important Street Fighter II, Sega found ways to fight back, either through software, marketing, or both. Super Mario World? Slow and childlike compared to Sonic the Hedgehog. Street Fighter II? Sure, that's cool for Nintendo fans, but only Sega could give you an uncensored Mortal Kombat experience. Oh, and those little NES-looking guys in Final Fantasy II are so cute. Have you seen the kick-ass cinema and combat graphics in the Phantasy Star games? Even franchises that had formerly been the exclusive dominion of Nintendo systems, like Castlevania, Ninja Turtles, and Mega Man, showed up on Genesis, where they looked and played great. The addition of third parties as a central factor in the Genesis library, as opposed to being random dabblers as on Master System, greatly expanded the appeal and scope of the console's library over that of its predecessor. But maybe even more importantly, it gave Sega's home development teams some breathing room for the first time. Again, we saw this with Famicom. In that console's early days, Nintendo had to produce the console's entire lineup internally, and the resulting games were generally good but slight. Beefy selections like Super Mario Bros. Were only really possible once third parties arrived. As third parties came to comprise the vast majority of Famicom and NES releases, Nintendo slowed its development schedule and began to produce only a few games per year, nearly all of which turned out to be system-selling killer app events. And we saw the same thing on Master System, where Sega's home teams had to crank out title after title, with only a few months of production time for each, and the games suffered for their lack of seasoning. Sega made some really good original console games during the Master System era, but the real standouts like Phantasy Star highlighted how much better the Sega library could be if each team had the time and resources to go all in. And during the Genesis era, that level of time and resources became increasingly available to Sega's teams as the pressure of propping up the console all alone steadily decreased. The 8-bit Sega could never have released two console-exclusive titles on par with the sublime Shinobi 3 or Phantasy Star 4 in the space of 3 months. 16-bit Sega, on the other hand, had that kind of bandwidth, and the freedom to create such high-quality work only served to further cement the Genesis's value. In short, Genesis made Sega a viable alternative to Nintendo's ecosystem. All the games that drew players to NES and Super NES, like mascot platformers, action RPGs, brawlers, sports games, those showed up on Genesis too. And in most cases, those games were as good or better than their Nintendo equivalents. Sure, Sega didn't have anything on par with Super Metroid or The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, but by the same token, Nintendo didn't have anything that played like Gunstar Heroes or Sonic the Hedgehog. The popularity of Genesis shattered Nintendo's grip on the Western console market. The NES famously owned something like 90% of the US market at one point, and Nintendo would never have anything close to that kind of market share again outside of the portable space. Really, the fact that Genesis eventually fell behind the Super NES is as much on Sega as it is on Nintendo. Sure, some of that is down to Nintendo's aggressive exclusive content push, which was bolstered by the massive success of the Super Famicom in Japan. Nintendo still had command over a huge array of Japanese developers who didn't work with Sega, which meant that fans of games with a more Japanese vibe had plenty of reason to own Super NES. That entire pipeline of software was largely unavailable to Sega. But they still did pretty well for themselves with the likes of Renovation, Game Arts, and Treasure on their team. No, Sega's biggest threat during the Genesis era was Sega. The company didn't quite seem to understand how to deal with its own success, and developed a habit of tripping over its own feet. The political divide between the company's Japanese and American offices played a part in this confusion. Being based in Tokyo, Sega's leadership didn't love the fact that its biggest profit center was the US, and the clout that those earnings gave the American arm. At the same time, Sega couldn't give up its love of iterative releases. Their tendency to iterate on hardware slowed from the 8-bit days, kind of. The Sega CD arrived, followed by the CDX and XI, and then the Nomad Portable, and then the 32X. The 32X proved to be the bridge too far, a 32-bit add-on that brought polygonal 3D to the console, but also muddled the marketing message around the actual 32-bit Saturn console that arrived mere months later. Sega never found its footing again as a hardware maker after the 32X. Even the mighty Dreamcast was laid low by circumstance. But Segaiden's Genesis Works isn't about the Dreamcast, it's about the Genesis, by far Sega's most successful console release ever on the international stage. A massive hit in America, and at least as big, if not bigger, in Europe. When people say they're Sega fanatics, they're most likely talking about how much they loved the Genesis. In the space of about 6 years, Genesis delivered both great arcade ports, that 6 of 16 heritage in action, and knockout original titles. Sega produced great games, and third parties delivered as well. And even the Sega CD ruled, despite the poor reputation it's picked up because of all those FMB games. Ignore the rubes. And thanks to modern releases like the Sega Ages line and the Sega Genesis Mini microconsole, the Genesis continues to live on. Certainly, it will thrive here on this channel. Going forth, I'll be covering releases for Genesis in parallel with NES games, beginning with the launch lineup. Next time on Segaiden, I think that's all. You're about to find out you're wrong, just when you thought you were right.